The Grand Champion ribbon, a violent splash of purple and gold against the weathered pine of the judging pen, seemed to hum in the oppressive August heat. Marcus Thorne stared at it, his face a carefully constructed mask of gentlemanly composure that was beginning to crack at the seams, like old leather left too long in the sun. His own bull, Sterling Pride the Fourth, a magnificent creature of perfect lines and documented lineage, stood second, his massive head lowered in what looked like shame. But the prize went to a yearling steer sired by a ghost, a bull no one had ever seen in a show ring, a bull whose name was only just beginning to be whispered with a kind of fearful reverence through the valley. Elspeth Vance stood beside the winning steer, one hand resting calmly on its broad, quiet back. She didn't smile, she didn't preen, she simply stood, her stillness a rebuke to the frantic energy of the fairground, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the cheering crowd. 6 years.
6 years ago, they had all laughed at her. 6 years ago, when she'd bought the worthless thing that had sired this champion, and 5 more before it, they hadn't called her a prodigy. They had called her a fool, and the whole sorry project, the widow's folly. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? It began, as so many endings do, in the damp chill of a November auction barn. The air was thick with the smells of wet wool, manure, and desperation. It was the last livestock sale before the heavy snows would seal the valley off from the wider world, a time for ranchers to cut their losses and brace for the lean months ahead. Elspeth sat alone on a high splintered bench, a small, still figure in her late husband's worn canvas coat. 2 years he'd been gone, and the pity of her neighbours had long since curdled into a kind of impatient expectation. They were all waiting for her to fail, to sell the 200 acres of hard-scrabble upland pasture that she insisted on calling home, and move to town to do some respectable woman's work. One person alone couldn't run a cattle farm. It was an equation everyone in the valley understood. Everyone but her. The auctioneer's patter was a hypnotic, rhythmic drone, the sound of fortunes rising and falling with the flick of a finger, the nod of a head. Lot after lot of solid, dependable stock passed through the ring, fetching solid, dependable prices. Then the gate creaked open, and a collective sigh somewhere between a groan and a laugh went through the crowd. The calf was a pathetic sight. Scrawny, no more than 80 pounds, with a coat the colour of dishwater and a distinct, sorrowful twist to his left foreleg that made him hobble in a pained circle. He was a late-season mistake, a throwaway. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this fine specimen?" The auctioneer drawled, his voice heavy with sarcasm. Silence. A few chuckles rippled through the stands. The calf blinked its long, dark lashes, looking utterly lost under the harsh electric lights. $10, the auctioneer pleaded. "5 then. Somebody give me $5 to get him out of my sight." More silence. The animal was a liability. It would cost more in milk replacer to get it through the winter than it would ever be worth as beef. And as breeding stock, it was a joke, a genetic dead end.
Marcus Thorne, who owned the largest ranch on the valley floor and whose prize-winning Sterling Pride line was the gold standard, leaned forward in his front row seat. "Just take him out back, Jimmy," he called out, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Don't waste our time." It was then that Elspeth's voice, quiet but clear, cut through the murmuring. $35. A hush fell over the barn. Every head turned to look at the widow on the high bench. The auctioneer's jaw went slack. "Ma'am?" "35, she repeated, her voice perfectly level. She didn't look at anyone, just at the calf, who had stopped his pained circling and was looking back at her. Thorne let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Elspeth, what in God's name are you going to do with that? It's broken." She didn't answer him. Her bid was a statement, not a negotiation. Sold! The auctioneer barked, slamming his gavel down before she could change her mind. To the widow Vance for $35. The laughter that followed was louder this time, less restrained. It followed her as she made her way down the rickety stairs, as she counted out the worn bills into the clerk's hand, and as she led the limping, terrified calf out into the gray November twilight. The widow's folly had begun. She got him home in the back of her old truck, the calf shivering on a bed of clean straw. Her farm was not like the lush, sprawling ranches on the valley floor. It was high country, clinging to the side of the mountain, where the soil was thin and the wind never seemed to stop. Her husband, Daniel, had loved it for its stark beauty, for the way the light hit the granite outcrops at dawn. The community saw it as a place of last resort. After he was gone, the silence in the small clapboard house had been a physical weight.
The pitying casseroles and the gentle suggestions that she sold to Thorne had felt like stones being piled on her chest. But leaving was never an option. This land held the last of him, and a stubbornness grew best in poor soil. It was a truth she was coming to understand. She settled the calf in a small, clean pen in the corner of the barn, warm and deep with fresh bedding, a bucket of warm milk replacer laced with rich cream from her one dairy cow waiting for him. He drank weakly at first, then with a frantic, desperate hunger. She sat on a stool watching him, her mind working through the cold, hard numbers, the arithmetic of survival. $35 for the calf, $4 a bag for milk replacer, he'd need a bag a week for at least 2 months, hay for the winter, vet bills if that leg got worse. It was a foolish gamble by any sensible measure. But Elspeth saw things others didn't. She had an eye for the hidden value in what the world discarded.
She'd seen it in the crooked calf's eyes, not fear, not stupidity, a deep, steady, quiet intelligence, a will to live. It was the same will she felt burning in her own chest. One person alone was not a sentence, it was a beginning. The next morning, her nearest neighbour, Mr. Jaeger, appeared at her fence line. He was an old man who had come from some forgotten corner of the Alps decades ago, and he still spoke with the clipped musical cadence of his homeland. He was as weathered and tough as the ancient junipers that dotted his own rocky pastures. He'd seen her bring the calf home. The whole valley knew by now. The town laughs, he said. It wasn't a question. Let them, Elspeth said, not looking up from the trough she was mending. Mr. Jaeger leaned on the fence post, his pale blue eyes squinting as he watched the calf hobble around its small enclosure. He didn't mock. He just watched for a long, silent time. In my country, he said finally, his voice a low rumble, we have a saying. The strongest trees, Elspeth, are not in the sheltered forest. They grow on the windy hill, where they must fight for the sun. He nodded once, a gesture of profound understanding, and walked away. The words settled into her mind and took root. The windy hill. That was her land. That was this calf. That was her. A few days later, she gained an unlikely partner, a boy named Finn from a family down the road with too many children and not enough of anything else, started appearing at the edge of her property. He was a whisper of a child, all sharp angles and watchful eyes, with a habit of fading into the background. He never spoke, just watched her work with the calf. Elspeth would leave a glass of milk and a thick slice of bread on the porch rail, and it would be gone when she looked again. One afternoon, she was gently massaging the calf's crooked leg, working the knotted muscle as the vet had shown her. The calf flinched and struggled. Finn materialized beside her. He needs a name, the boy whispered. It was the first time she'd heard him speak. His voice was husky from disuse. A name? Elspeth asked. So he knows he's a somebody, Finn said, not just a thing. He reached out a small, hesitant hand and stroked the calf's bony flank. I call him Anchor, he said, because he's so stuck to the ground.
like he can't be moved. Elspeth looked from the boy to the calf and back again. Anchor. It was a name of impossible weight and solidity for such a fragile creature. It was perfect. From that day on, Finn was a fixture in her barn, a silent, devoted apprentice in the slow, patient work of reclamation. The first snows of December sealed them in. The valley below disappeared under a blanket of white, and Elspeth's world shrank to the house, the barn, and the path she shovelled between them. The work was the rhythm of her days. Before dawn, she'd be in the barn, the air sharp with cold, a breath pluming in the light of the lantern. She and Finn would mix the warm milk for Anchor, their quiet movements a practiced choreography. The calf's leg was the focus of their shared, unspoken hope. Every day, twice a day, Elspeth would spend an hour working on it, her strong, calloused hands kneading and stretching the tight ligaments, encouraging the bone to find its proper alignment. The arithmetic of the bone, she thought, was different from the arithmetic of the ledger. It was a calculation of patience, not profit. Some days there seemed to be no change. Other days she thought she felt a subtle easing, a fractional straightening. She banked these tiny successes like coals under ash, guarding them against the cold winds of doubt. When the March thaw came, turning the world to mud and promise, Anchor was transformed. The milk and good hay had put muscle on his frame, and the constant patient therapy had worked a small miracle. His leg was still not perfectly straight, but the painful hobble was gone, replaced by a rolling, powerful gait. He was still small for his age, but he was dense, compact, with a deep chest and a breadth across his shoulders that hinted at a strength far greater than his size suggested. Mr. Yeager's words echoed in her mind. The windy hill. The struggle had forged something unbreakable in the calf. He had a hardiness that the pampered, perfectly formed calves on Thorne's ranch would never know. Finn let him out into the small pasture for the first time, and the boy and the bull stood together under the pale spring sun, two overlooked souls who had found their footing on the stony ground. Elspeth watched from the porch, feeling a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the changing season. Through that spring and summer the work continued. Elspeth and Finn mended fences that had been neglected for years, cleared brush, and reseeded the high pasture with a tough, drought-resistant mix of grasses Mr. Yeager had recommended. Anchor grew steadily, his dishwater coat shedding out to reveal a deep, glossy black. He was never large, never a showstopper in the way of Thorne's bulls, but he had an air of profound competence. He moved with an economy of motion, his dark, intelligent eyes taking in everything. He was watchful, calm, and utterly self-possessed. Elspeth kept him in the back pasture, far from the road that led down into the valley. She knew what the others would see. A runt, a cripple, the evidence of her folly. They were not yet ready to see what she and Finn and Mr. Yeager saw.
It was easier to believe a thing was rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it.
The truth of his worth was her secret, a treasure buried in the high pasture. The next spring, when Anchor was just over 2 years old, Elspeth bred him to her 2 best heifers. It felt like a momentous act of faith. She was betting the future of her small herd, her entire farm, on the flawed genetics of a $35 bull. The calves were born the following March, on a night when a late blizzard raged outside the barn. They were small but vibrantly alive, square and sturdy on their feet within an hour. They had their father's deep chest and his calm, intelligent eyes. They thrived. Elspeth sold one of the bull calves at a regional auction far from her own valley, where no one knew his lineage. He fetched a surprisingly high price.
A rancher from 3 counties over stopped her afterward.
"That's a fine calf, ma'am," he'd said. "Good bone. Where'd you say the sire was from?" Elspeth had just smiled. "He's from right here," she'd said. "He's from the Windy Hill." She put the money away, another coal banked against the future. That summer, Marcus Thorne's gleaming truck pulled into her lane. He got out, all polished boots and easy confidence, a sheaf of papers in his hand. He'd come to make his annual offer on her land. He treated it as a kind of charitable ritual, the powerful man helping the poor widow. He leaned against the fence, his gaze sweeping over her small but healthy herd of crossbred cows grazing peacefully.
Anchor was out of sight in his high pasture. Elspeth, he began, his voice dripping with false warmth. You've done well to hang on this long. I admire your spirit. But this is no life for a woman alone. Look, the market's down. I can give you a fair price, enough to get you a nice little house in town. Settle down. It's time. He named a figure that was an insult. It was the arithmetic of greed, plain and simple. I'm not ready to sell, Marcus, she said, her voice quiet. His smile tightened. Don't be proud. There's no shame in admitting you can't manage. My sterling pride line is siring the best calves in the state. My operation is expanding. Your land borders my best grazing. It just makes sense. He spoke of his prize bull as if it were royalty, a creature of immense value and importance. His price was determined by a ledger, by show ribbons and bloodlines written on paper.
The worth of her bull was written in the muscle and bone of his offspring, in their ability to survive.
Thank you for the offer, she said, turning to walk back to the house, but the answer is no. His condescension curdled into a flash of irritation. You're making a mistake, he called after her. This land is worthless without a real bull to service your herd. She didn't turn around. A quiet truth needs no defense. His judgment was based on what he could see, and she had learned to hide the things that mattered most. The reckoning came the following year. It started as a rumour, a whisper from the lowlands, and then it arrived with the late summer rains. They called it the red hoof. A virulent strain of hoof rot, fast spreading and devastatingly effective. It thrived in the rich damp soil of the valley floor, the very land that made the big ranches so productive. Thorne's herd, with their pampered genetics and generations of inbreeding for aesthetic perfection, had no resistance.
The disease moved like a foul wind from one pristine pasture to the next. It began with a limp, then lesions, then a fever that wasted the magnificent animals, turning them into skeletal ghosts of their former glory. The vet came and went, his face grimmer with each visit, his expensive medicines proving useless against the blight. The valley's economy, built entirely on the reputation of its superior cattle, began to crumble. Elspeth's farm, high on its windy, well-drained slope, remained an island of health in a sea of sickness. Her tough, crossbred cows, grazed on sparse but varied forage, had immune systems forged by generations of hardship. And Anchor, the bull who had started life as a broken thing, passed on more than just his conformation. He passed on his own profound, unshakable resilience. His own calves, scattered across her pastures, were untouched. They grew strong and steady, while the prize-winning stock in the valley below wasted away.
The fortune of the valley had inverted. The perfect had proven fragile, and the broken, hardy.
At first, the valley's mockery of Elspeth simply stopped. The laughter was replaced by a sullen, suspicious silence. As the red hoof worsened, that silence turned to whispers. How was the widow's herd untouched? It wasn't natural. There were dark mutterings at the general store, hints of witchcraft or some devil's bargain. It was the old familiar refrain. It was always easier to call a thing a curse than to admit you'd been a fool to laugh at it. But as the weeks turned into a desperate month, and Elspeth's cattle remained the only healthy stock for miles, suspicion began to curdle into a desperate, grudging respect. Men who had once laughed at her now watched her from a distance, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. They saw her calves, solid and vigorous, and they saw their own empty pastures, and they began to understand a different kind of arithmetic. The arithmetic of survival.
Marcus Thorne was the last to break. Pride was a bone in his throat.
He'd lost nearly half his herd, including his prized bull, sterling pride the fourth. His wealth, his reputation, his entire identity was tied to his cattle, and they were dying. Finally, his desperation outweighed his pride. His truck tore up her lane again, kicking up dust. This time there was no false warmth, no condescending smile. His face was pale and drawn. "Elspeth," he said, his voice raw, "I need your bull." She stood on her porch, wiping her hands on her apron, and said nothing. "I need to buy him," he clarified, his voice cracking. "I need his bloodline. Whatever it is, that hardiness, I need it. Name your price." She just looked at him, a silence unnerving him more than any argument could. He took a deep breath, trying to regain some semblance of control.
He thought he was negotiating from a position of power, that his money still meant something.
"Look," he said, trying for a reasonable tone, "I'll give you $10,000 for him, cash. And I'll take the heifers too. I know you have 6 prime heifers from him. I'll give you 2,000 apiece for them." And there it was, the fatal slip. The single piece of information he should not have possessed. Elspeth had never told anyone the exact count of her new heifers. No one knew but her and Finn. In his desperate attempt to control the situation, to show he knew the extent of her assets, Thorne had revealed his own dishonesty. He'd had someone watching her, counting her stock, spying on her from the road. He had been calculating the value of her success, even as he publicly dismissed it. A quiet gaze hardened into something as solid as granite. She finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "You have been counting my cattle, Marcus." It wasn't a question.
The colour drained from his face. He had overplayed his hand, betrayed by the very arithmetic of greed that had always guided him. He stammered, trying to backtrack, but the damage was done. The trust, which had never really existed between them, was now definitively broken. "My bull is not for sale," she said, and she went inside, closing the door behind her, leaving him alone in the dust of her driveway. The confrontation came 2 nights later at a desperate emergency meeting at the town co-op. The air was thick with the smell of fear. Ranchers who had been rivals for generations were now united in their shared ruin. Thorne, trying to reclaim his authority, took the floor. He spoke of a community solution, of pooling resources, of the need for sacrifice for the greater good. It was all a preamble. He turned, his eyes finding Elspeth where she stood at the back of the room. "Elspeth Vance has been fortunate," he said, his voice ringing with false magnanimity. "Her herd has been spared, and she has the bull whose bloodline we now know carries a resistance to this plague. For the good of the valley, for all of us to survive, I have offered to buy that bull, to bring his genetics into the community herd. She has refused." A murmur went through the crowd. He was painting her as selfish, a hoarder of the cure. "Now is not the time for personal profit," he thundered. "We are a community. I am asking her now in front of all of you to do the right thing. Sell us the bull." All eyes turned to Elspeth. In the past, she would have shrunk from their collective gaze, but not anymore. She walked slowly to the front of the room, her worn work boots making a steady sound on the dusty floorboards. She stood before them, not angry, but resolute. "I remember another time I was in a room with all of you," she began, a voice carrying to every corner. "It was a sale barn, 6 years ago, and I bought a calf. A crooked-legged calf nobody wanted. You all laughed." A few of the older ranchers had the decency to look at the floor. "You called him, and me, a folly. That calf cost me $35. She let the number hang in the air. "Mr. Thorne is right. There is a time for profit, and there is a time for community. But he and I, we use a different kind of math. There is the arithmetic of the ledger, Mr. Thorne, that sees only profit and loss,
that counts another person's cattle from the road. It's the math that offers $10,000 for what it once scorned as worthless. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her neighbours. And then there is the arithmetic of the bone. It's the math that knows what it costs to get a weak thing through a hard winter. It knows the price of faith when you have none, and the value of patience when you're all alone. It's the math of a boy who gives a broken thing a name so it knows it's a somebody. Finn, who was standing near the door, flushed with pride. "My bull is not for sale," Elspeth said again, her voice ringing with finality. "He is not a commodity for Mr. Thorne's ledger, but his strength belongs to this valley. It was forged on the windy hill, and it will stay here." A confused silence filled the room. "I will not sell him," she said, "but I will offer his service to any rancher here who needs to rebuild their herd. The stud fee will be what I paid for him on the day you all laughed." She looked directly at Marcus Thorne, his face a mask of disbelief and utter humiliation. "The price," she said, her voice clear and strong, "is $35. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a stunned, absolute silence. In that one moment, Elspeth had done more than save their ranches. She had recalibrated the moral compass of the entire valley. She had held all the power to demand a fortune, the power for revenge. And she had chosen grace. Thorne stood there, exposed and diminished, shamed not by an accuser's rage, but by a quiet woman's generosity. The community was not bound to her by a debt they could never repay, but by a gift they would never forget. 2 years later, the valley was green again. The herds were smaller, but they were tough, resilient. Dotted across the pastures, from the valley floor to the highest hills, were black, sturdy calves with deep chests and calm, intelligent eyes. They were known, simply, as anchor stock. The name was no longer an irony. It was a promise. Elspeth's farm was no longer the widow's folly. It was the heart of the valley's recovery. She was not alone anymore. Finn, now a tall, capable young man of 17, worked alongside her, a partner in all but name. He was the one who kept the new ledger, the one that tracked not dollars, but the slow, steady rebirth of a community. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows from the mountains, Mr. Jaeger came and sat with her on the porch. They watched as Anker, now in his magnificent prime, grazed peacefully in his high pasture, surrounded by his progeny. The old man was quiet for a long time, his gaze serene. "The windy hill, Elspeth," he said, his voice soft with satisfaction. "It makes for strong roots." She nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. The accounts, the ones that truly mattered, were finally beautifully balanced. The arithmetic of the bone had won.